For the vast majority of human history, our ancestors had no fixed address of any kind. No walls, no roof, no single place they returned to night after night. They slept wherever the day's travel happened to end, under overhangs, inside natural caves, or simply in the open, moving constantly to follow food, water, and favorable weather. And yet at some point, something shifted, and humans began doing something no other primate has ever done in the same deliberate way. They started building permanent, dedicated structures specifically for the purpose of living inside them. The question of why we started building homes seems almost too obvious at first glance until you realize the actual reasons run far deeper than simply wanting shelter from the rain. The earliest evidence of deliberately constructed human shelters dates back remarkably far, with some archaeological sites in Africa suggesting simple shelter construction may stretch back nearly 2 million years, long before anything resembling modern humans existed. These earliest structures were simple, likely nothing more than branches and animal hides arranged into a basic windbreak or lean-to, but the underlying behavior they represent is genuinely significant. Early hominins were already making a conscious decision to modify their environment, rather than simply accepting whatever natural shelter happened to already exist around them. This distinction matters enormously, because it marks one of the earliest known examples of humans actively engineering their surroundings to meet a specific need, rather than passively adapting to conditions as they found them. Protection from predators represents one of the most consistently supported explanations for why early humans began building enclosed shelters, and the logic behind it is straightforward once you consider the environment early humans actually lived in. Unlike many predator species, early humans lacked sharp claws, powerful jaws, thick protective hides, or the ability to run at especially high speeds, which made nighttime, when human vision is significantly weaker than that of many nocturnal predators, an especially vulnerable period. A structure with even minimal walls and a single defensible entrance dramatically reduced the number of directions from which a predator could realistically launch a surprise attack, converting an open, vulnerable sleeping area into something far more defensible, even if that structure was built from nothing more sophisticated than branches, brush, and packed earth. Climate and weather protection provided an equally powerful, and in many regions considerably more urgent, evolutionary pressure toward permanent shelter construction. As early human populations migrated out of Africa and into significantly colder, harsher climates across Europe and Asia, exposure to extreme cold, wind, rain, and snow became a genuinely life-threatening problem in a way it simply hadn't been in the warmer environments many human ancestors originally evolved in. Archaeological evidence from Ice Age sites shows increasingly sophisticated shelter construction techniques appearing specifically in these colder regions, including structures built using mammoth bones as a structural framework, layered animal hides for insulation, and sunken floor designs specifically engineered to trap and retain warmth, none of which would have been remotely necessary in a milder, more forgiving climate. Fire management adds another critical layer to why permanent shelter construction became so evolutionarily important once humans gained control of fire. Maintaining a fire reliably through an entire night required a stable, protected location, since wind, rain, or simply the practical difficulty of constantly relocating a fire source made portable, temporary fire maintenance genuinely impractical on an ongoing basis. A dedicated shelter provided a stable, protected space specifically suited to maintaining a consistent fire, which in turn provided warmth, light, protection from predators who generally avoid fire, and a reliable location for cooking food, creating a powerful, mutually reinforcing relationship between fire use and permanent shelter construction that likely accelerated the development of both technologies significantly faster than either would have advanced entirely on its own. Food storage represents another often overlooked but genuinely critical factor in why permanent shelters became increasingly important as human societies evolved. Once early humans began accumulating surplus food, whether through increasingly organized hunting practices, systematic gathering, or eventually agriculture, that surplus needed genuine physical protection from rain, pests, scavenging animals, and simple spoilage from direct sun and moisture exposure. A dedicated, enclosed structure provided a controlled, protected environment specifically suited to storing food safely over meaningfully extended periods of time, which in turn allowed human groups to survive seasonal food shortages far more reliably and consistently than groups relying purely on immediate, day-to-day foraging and hunting ever realistically could. The relationship between permanent shelter and agriculture deserves particular attention, because the two developments appear to have reinforced and accelerated one another in a genuinely powerful feedback loop throughout human history. Agriculture inherently requires remaining in one specific location for extended periods, since crops obviously need consistent tending, protection, and eventual harvesting exactly where they were originally planted. Once humans committed to staying in a single location specifically to farm effectively, building a genuinely permanent, durable home in that same location became dramatically more practical and worthwhile than it had ever been for a highly mobile hunter-gatherer group that might realistically relocate every few weeks or months depending on available resources. Social and psychological factors played a meaningful role in permanent shelter development as well, factors that are frequently underestimated in purely practical or survival-focused explanations of why homes emerged. A dedicated home provided a stable, clearly defined, and consistently recognized personal or family territory, distinct from clearly shared communal or public space, which likely helped reduce a wide range of everyday social conflicts specifically related to resource ownership, personal privacy, and general living space within an increasingly larger and more socially complex group. Anthropologists studying various indigenous and traditional societies have consistently found that clearly defined personal living space frequently correlates with measurably reduced everyday interpersonal conflict, suggesting permanent shelter may have served an important underlying social regulation function well beyond its more obvious physical and practical protective benefits. Child-rearing represents another significant and often underappreciated factor in why permanent shelter construction became increasingly important as human societies grew more complex. Human infants are famously helpless for an unusually extended developmental period compared to nearly every other mammal species, requiring years of consistent, intensive care before achieving even basic independence. A stable, protected, and genuinely predictable home environment likely provided meaningfully better developmental conditions for human infants and young children specifically, compared to a constantly mobile, frequently changing living situation with regularly shifting physical surroundings and considerably less predictable daily routines and structure. The transition from simple temporary shelters to genuinely permanent, architecturally sophisticated homes accelerated dramatically once humans began settling into the earliest known permanent villages roughly 12,000 years ago, closely coinciding with the broader shift toward organized agriculture across multiple regions of the world. Sites like Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey show remarkably sophisticated architectural planning at surprisingly early dates, including deliberately organized room layouts, distinct designated spaces for specific everyday activities, and genuinely impressive structural engineering achievements for their particular time period, demonstrating that permanent shelter construction rapidly evolved well beyond pure basic survival necessity into something approaching genuine architectural sophistication remarkably quickly once the underlying conditions for it were firmly established. It's genuinely worth noting that not every early human society transitioned to permanent shelters and settled living at the exact same pace or for precisely identical underlying reasons, and this meaningful variation itself tells us something important about the topic. Some populations, particularly in regions with abundant, consistently reliable, and predictable natural resources, maintained more mobile or semi-permanent shelter traditions for considerably longer historical periods than others, since the specific pressures driving permanent settlement, predator protection, harsh climate, effective food storage, or organized agriculture simply weren't equally present or equally urgent in every single environment across the world. This variation strongly suggests permanent shelter construction wasn't some kind of single, universal, inevitable evolutionary stage every human society was destined to pass through identically, but rather a highly practical, adaptive response to a specific and often unique combination of environmental, social, and economic pressures and available local resources. Put all of these threads together, and the modern home, sitting quietly and unremarkably on nearly every street in almost every city and town across the entire world today, reveals itself as something considerably more significant than simple shelter from passing rain. It's a direct, unbroken evolutionary response to predator threat, an unforgiving and often dangerous climate, the fundamental practical need for reliable fire management, effective long-term food storage, and the specific practical demands of organized agriculture, important underlying social and psychological territorial needs, and the genuinely extended, Resource-intensive developmental requirements of raising human children successfully to adulthood. Every single time you close your own front door at the end of a long day, you're participating in a behavior that stretches back, in some meaningful and continuous form, nearly 2 million years into the deep evolutionary past, to the very first hominins who made the surprisingly consequential decision that where you sleep shouldn't simply be left entirely up to chance.